March 14, 1944, the Hukong Valley, northern Burma. A 12-man patrol from the 1st Battalion of the 5307th Composite Unit Provisional, the men history would later call Merrill's Marauders, is moving single file through secondary jungle so dense that the man 4 positions ahead is invisible. You are Private First Class Raymond Hollies, 22 years old, from Macon, Georgia, and you have been inside this jungle for 16 days without a fixed position. If you are PFC Hollies, you already know things no training manual taught you. You know that the Imperial Japanese Army's 18th Division, the Chrysanthemum Division, has been fighting in jungle since 1937 and has no fear of it. You know that a Japanese infantryman can dig a spider hole in laterite soil and lie inside it, motionless, for 14 hours before springing a coordinated ambush. You know that when you stop hearing birds, something is wrong. You know that the man who fires first in this jungle rarely determines the outcome. It is the man who positioned himself correctly in the dark 4 hours before you arrived. You are carrying 72 pounds, rifle, ammunition, a radio component, K-rations for 4 days, a machete, a ground sheet, 1 morphine syringe, and a field dressing. You are walking as quietly as you have ever walked in your life. Your boots make no sound on the root-tangled floor. And against your chest, in a canvas sling that once held a rangefinder component, you are carrying something that weighs 4.5 pounds and has a tail longer than your forearm. Allied Theater Quartermaster, records for the China-Burma-India Command, reconstructed from Unit Diaries Supply Requisitions. In G4 logs now held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, document the acquisition of at least 247 primates distributed to patrol elements across 6 theater commands between August 1943 and the Japanese surrender in August 1945. Primarily rhesus macaques and pig-tailed macaques, with a smaller number of long-tailed macaques obtained from Kachin village traders in northern Burma. Several appear on supply manifests between surgical plasma and .30 caliber ball ammunition. At least 4 were assigned quartermaster identification numbers and logged as equipment rather than livestock. Pause on that word, not mascots, not pets, not morale assets, equipment. Here is the sentence that explains the entire Burma campaign. The Imperial Japanese Army had built the most effective ambush system in the history of modern infantry warfare. And the Allies had found the only biological mechanism on Earth that could detect it before it fired. Part 1. The machine that swallows patrols. To understand why a soldier in the Burmese jungle carried a monkey, you first have to understand what he was afraid of. And to do that, you have to enter the Japanese infantry doctrine that had been killing Allied soldiers since December 1941 with a consistency so mechanical that British commanders initially refused to believe the casualty reports were accurate. The Imperial Japanese Army did not stumble into jungle warfare. They built a system for it, deliberately and over years, across successive campaigns in China, Malaya, and the Philippines. By 1944, that system was codified in the operational guidelines of the Southern Army's Jungle Operations Supplement, a field doctrine built atop the foundational Senjinkan of January 1941, and it had produced infantrymen who could fight in conditions that collapsed Western units entirely. The core idea was precise in its elegance. The Japanese infantryman did not seek to outgun his opponent. He sought to eliminate the opponent's ability to use his guns at all. The principle ran through every level of Japanese jungle doctrine. Senshin, vanguard spirit, expressed tactically as a demand for positional advantage before engagement was ever initiated. A Japanese infantry squad of 13 men, including the Type 96 light machine gun crew of 4, could establish what their doctrine designated a takeout, a resistance point, in under 10 minutes in primary jungle. They had drilled this until the spacing between positions was muscle memory. The machine gun elevated 3 degrees for grazing fire at ankle height across the likely approach route, 2 rifle groups positioned to cover the instinctive withdrawal routes that Allied soldiers under fire moved toward. And the squad commander positioned in the center, where he could signal with hand pressure rather than voice. The ambush was not triggered when the enemy appeared. It was triggered when the enemy's point man crossed a specific, pre-selected terrain feature, a stream crossing, a trail bend, the near edge of a clearing, at which point the lead element of the enemy patrol would already be 6 to 8 meters inside the kill zone. The first burst from the machine gun was not designed to kill the point man. It was designed to make every man behind him reflexively move forward, toward the sound, further into the zone, while the flanking rifle groups closed. The 18th Division, the Chrysanthemum Division, commanded in 1944 by Lieutenant General Shinichi Tanaka, who had personally led the division through the conquest of Singapore in February 1942, had been executing this method since Malaya and had refined it for the specific terrain of the Burmese valley systems. Tanaka's division developed a particular elaboration of the standard takeout that his operational staff called the Hoko Formation, when a forward ambush element made contact with an allied point man. Two flanking squads simultaneously moved through parallel jungle, having been pre-positioned hours earlier, to cut off the rear of the patrol at a point 50 meters behind the point of contact. The patrol leader would hear firing ahead, turn toward it, and walk his rear element into a second ambush that had been waiting before anyone fired a shot. It worked because it was built around a single observation about Allied infantry that was not a stereotype but an empirical fact. Allied patrols moved on trails. They had to. The alternative, cutting through primary jungle at a rate of perhaps 150 meters per hour with machetes, meant arriving at objectives too exhausted to fight and departing too slowly to avoid encirclement. Trails were not a tactical weakness. They were a logistical necessity, and trails could be mapped. Trails had predictable approach angles, predictable choke points, predictable features where the terrain funneled a moving column into a narrow frontage. A trail junction in the Yukon Valley could be ambushed at a point of the ambusher's choosing, on a timeline of the ambusher's choosing, in conditions that converted the trail user's speed advantage into a vulnerability. A junior officer in the 18th Division's 55th Infantry Regiment, writing in a field diary captured at Myitkyina in August 1944, described the system with the calm confidence of a man who had used it many times. The enemy moves on the path because the jungle punishes him otherwise. We know which paths he must use. We arrive before him. He arrives exactly as expected. What the Japanese system demanded in return for this tactical lethality was a specific kind of soldier and a specific kind of supply calculation. A takeout and ambush required men who could remain motionless for up to 14 hours in monsoon humidity, men who could suppress the body's instinct to shift, to adjust, to cough, to scratch, while ants and leeches traversed them. This was not a natural capacity. It was the product of training that had no Western equivalent, a conditioning process that the IJA had been running continuously since the late 1930s. The supply arithmetic that supported this doctrine was stark. The 18th Division's forward supply line by mid-1944 ran from Myitkyina over the Patkai foothills to forward positions in the Yukon Valley through a chain of mule trains and human porters that, on a good week, delivered approximately 55 tons of materiel to elements responsible for 20,000 men. The division's artillery, Type 90-475 mountain guns, the primary fire support weapon, was rationed to an average of 11 shells per tube per day. 11. The regimental medical staff operated without anesthesia or the ability to evacuate critically wounded soldiers to rear areas within the timeframe that trauma injuries require. They had built a system of extraordinary precision on a foundation of enforced scarcity. Every element of the takeout doctrine, the patience, the stillness, the willingness to wait in a hole while the jungle soaked through every layer of clothing, was simultaneously doctrine and necessity. A soldier who had 11 shells in support and no ability to call for more had to make the ambush work the first time. The system had been calibrated to this arithmetic until it was second nature. What that system could not conceive of, what it had no doctrine to defend against, was not a new weapon, not more soldiers, not superior firepower. It was something far more disorienting. It was the possibility that the jungle itself might give them away before they fired. Part 2: The Listening Forest. Here is the core idea, and it is so simple that it took 3 years of jungle warfare to extract it from the noise. The rhesus macaque, Macaca mulata, is not a complicated animal. It weighs between 8 and 17 pounds at maturity, depending on sex and habitat. It is distributed across a broad range of South and Southeast Asian environments, including the dense secondary growth and riverine jungle of the Yukon and Chindwon valleys in northern Burma. It lives in social troops of 15 to 80 individuals. Its entire social architecture is built around the detection and communication of threat. When a single macaque in a troop detects the presence of an unfamiliar large mammal, the specific threat signature of a human being moving through jungle, it produces a distinctive alarm vocalization within approximately 0.4 seconds of first detection. Every other member of the troop responds to this call not by assessing the threat independently, but by producing their own alarm calls immediately, regardless of whether they have personally detected anything. The sound propagates through the canopy. In primary jungle, it carries 150 to 200 meters. In secondary growth, it carries farther. The troop does not wait to determine the nature of the threat. It responds instantly and loudly to the fact of intrusion. A Japanese infantry squad established in a takeout position, having arrived in darkness, having spent 4 to 8 hours in perfect stillness, having brought no unfamiliar sound or light into the forest. That squad was invisible to Allied eyes and Allied ears. It was not invisible to the macaques that had occupied the same canopy section for years. The OSS Detachment 101, the American clandestine unit operating with Kachin Ranger guerrillas across the mountainous terrain of northern Burma, had known this since early 1943. The Kachin people of the Burmese highlands had been using primate alarm behavior as a navigational and threat detection tool for generations, across a landscape where leopards, tigers, and human raiders all required the same early warning. When Kachin scouts attached to Detachment 101 patrols moved through jungle, they maintained a form of double attention that their American counterparts initially could not parse. One layer tuned to visible terrain and ground-level sound, a second layer tuned to the behavior of the forest canopy above them. A macaque troop that went suddenly silent in a sector where it had been active meant human presence within 150 meters. A troop that escalated into full alarm calls, directing their sound in a specific direction, meant something large was moving in that direction within 50 meters. Lieutenant James Luce, an OSS officer attached to Detachment 101 who was later captured and survived the war, filed a detailed account with the Office of the Coordinator of Information in November 1945. The Kachin scouts did not explain what they were attending to. They simply halted, listened to something I could not isolate in the general noise of the jungle, and then told me there were men approximately 100 yards to our left flank. We flanked the position at distance and found a Japanese observation post of 3 men, positioned exactly where they had indicated. It was several more weeks before I understood the mechanism they were using. The mechanism, once articulated, was a revelation because of its scale. The jungle was not silent. It was a continuous, layered acoustic environment with a baseline that experienced ears could read the way a physician reads a patient's resting state. When that baseline changed, specifically when the macaque troop behavior that was a normal part of the canopy soundscape either ceased abruptly or shifted into alarm call patterns, it communicated a single, unambiguous fact. Something that did not belong in this particular section of jungle was present and moving. The Japanese infantry, who had mastered every dimension of human silence in the jungle, could not silence the canopy above them. By late 1943, patrol commanders in the Marauders and in Ord Wingate's 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, the 1st Chindit formation operating deep behind Japanese lines, had begun formalizing what the Kachin scouts had been doing by instinct. The formalization took 2 distinct shapes. The passive form was systematic. Patrol leaders trained themselves and their point elements to maintain continuous awareness of canopy sound, treating sudden primate alarm as a contact report requiring immediate lateral dispersion. This required no equipment, no supply chain modification, nothing beyond an instruction set, and enough time in the jungle to develop the ear for it. The active form required 4.5 pounds of rhesus macaque in a canvas sling. A macaque carried with a patrol, removed from its troop, in an environment of continuous mild stress, is already operating at elevated sensitivity. When it detects the presence of unfamiliar humans within its alert radius, humans whose scent profile and movement patterns do not match those of its familiar handlers, it responds faster and with greater specificity than the patrol's human senses can replicate. Tests conducted by the CBI Theater's G2 Intelligence Section in January 1944, using simulated ambush scenarios against experienced scout personnel, found that a handler-carried macaque produced its first alarm response an average of 31 seconds before the patrol's most experienced point man made any form of visual or auditory contact with the simulated threat element. 31 seconds in a takeout and ambush is not a tactical advantage. It is the difference between a patrol that is inside the kill zone and a patrol that is outside it. The 1st Battalion of the Marauders developed a specific protocol by early 1944. The animal handler walked 3rd in the column order, behind the point man and the 2nd scout, forward of the patrol leader. If the macaque's demeanor shifted, postural rigidity, suppressed vocalization, a particular tension in the hindquarters that experienced handlers learned to feel through the sling fabric, the handler raised a closed fist. The patrol halted and dispersed laterally into the jungle on both sides of the trail. If the macaque produced full alarm calls, the point man reversed course at a run, and the entire patrol moved perpendicular to the trail into primary jungle for a distance of at least 30 meters and went to ground. The takeout and ambush, triggered on an empty trail, collapsed. The flanking elements, moving to encircle a patrol that was no longer on the trail, found nothing. The ambush, the product of 14 hours of motionless preparation, had consumed its one opportunity on air. Brigadier General Frank Merrill, who had walked out of Burma with Stilwell in May 1942 as part of the longest retreat in British military history, and who had spent 22 months preparing to walk back in, authorized the practice theater-wide in the spring of 1944. It appeared in no formal operations order. It generated no doctrinal revision. On supply manifests, it appeared as a personnel entry, a unit mascot, an animal handler, 2 replacement macaques delivered by air to a forward airstrip near Shajuzup in March 1944. The Japanese intelligence officers, who examined captured Marauder supply documents, would have had no framework for interpreting what they were reading. What they could not have known, what no amount of intelligence analysis of those manifests could have revealed, was that the system making this possible was not the animal itself. It was the machine that could afford to deliver one. Part 3, the weight the jungle cannot bear. Here is the number that changes the entire picture. By the time the Hump airlift ceased operations in August 1945, the Air Transport Command's India-China Division had delivered an aggregate 650 tons of cargo over the eastern Himalayan range, over mountains that peaked at 15,000 feet. Through weather that killed aircraft with no warning on an air route that ATC crews called the Aluminum Trail for the wrecked airframes visible on the mountainsides below. At the peak of operations in July 1945, the airlift was moving 71,042 tons of cargo in a single month across terrain that had no road, no railway, and no alternative supply route. 71,000 tons per month, by air, over the highest mountain range in the world. The 18th Division's entire northern Burma supply chain, at its best operational capacity in 1943, could move approximately 220 tons per month to forward combat elements, for a division of 20,000 men, over roads and mule tracks that existed. Set those numbers next to each other and look at what they describe. It is not a difference of degree, it is a difference of category. The Hump airlift, built under Brigadier General Thomas Hardin's India-China Division, and ultimately expanded to employ over 35,000 American personnel, was not a better version of what the Japanese had. It was an entirely different kind of institution, operating according to entirely different assumptions about what the word possible meant. The airlift had been built not because it was efficient, but because the United States could afford to build something catastrophically inefficient and then iterate it into functionality. The accident rate in the operation's first year was staggering. 155 aircraft lost to weather, altitude, mechanical failure, and Japanese fighters along a route where the navigation aids were non-existent and the meteorological forecasting was essentially guesswork. In the first 6 months of 1943, the airlift was delivering an average of 3,000 tons per month, less than 5% of its eventual peak capacity. Any rational cost-benefit analysis of those early months, conducted by a staff officer trained in the arithmetic of scarcity, would have recommended termination. The Americans did not terminate it. They assigned more aircraft, trained more pilots, built more airfields on the Indian side of the mountains, and kept flying until the route was solved. They could do this because losing 155 aircraft and several hundred crew members, while deeply tragic in human terms, did not break the production mathematics of the American war economy. Between January 1943 and January 1944, American aircraft factories produced 85,898 military aircraft. 155 lost to the Hump was less than 0.2% of a single year's output. Every like and subscription to this channel keeps the story of the men who flew the Aluminum Trail alive for a few more people. They deserve that. This is the systemic layer that made the Macaque Protocol possible. Allied commanders in Burma operated inside a logistical environment where creativity was survivable, where an unconventional idea could be tested, fail, be modified, and be tested again, without each failure consuming a resource that could not be replaced. When an OSS officer in Detachment 101 decided to formally incorporate carried primates into patrol doctrine, the integration required animals, handlers, training time for handler personnel, supply chain modification for the animals' feed and veterinary needs, and a formal acquisition process through the theater quartermaster. In the American system, those requirements generated no measurable friction against the existing supply flow. In the 18th Division's logistical reality at the same moment, the arithmetic ran in an entirely different direction. Lieutenant General Tanaka's divisional records, captured at Miyakina and now held at the Japan Center for Asian Historical Records in Tokyo, document a supply situation in mid-1944 that had degraded past the threshold of operational viability by any conventional military standard, the division's artillery, which had been a decisive element in the Singapore campaign and the 1942 advance through Burma, was firing an average of 11 shells per gun per day, a rate that precluded sustained fire missions and forced gun crews to make targeting decisions that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. The medical establishment was operating without functional anesthesia. Regimental ration levels had fallen to approximately 60% of the stated minimum for a man engaged in heavy physical activity in tropical conditions. In a supply system operating at this level of constraint, the arithmetic of any proposed innovation runs through a single filter. What does this cost in terms of the resources we have, and is that cost less than the tactical gain it produces? A macaque costs 1 day's rations for a soldier who is already receiving 60% of minimum. The handler training time costs patrol capacity that the regiment can measure in contact towers against the enemy. The supply chain modification costs mule load capacity that is already insufficient. The answer to every question of innovation, in a system at the edge of operational collapse, is the same answer: we cannot afford it. Captain Earl Kleinfelter, the Marauders' G4 supply officer, wrote in his post-campaign report in a sentence that reads at first like administrative self-congratulation, and then, on reflection, reads like something considerably more precise. We were operating against one of the best light infantry forces in the world in the worst terrain I have ever seen, and we were better supplied than any unit I had worked with in 3 years of Army service. The weapon was not what was different. It was the abundance that gave commanders permission to think. Abundance did not just supply the Marauders. It changed what their commanders were allowed to believe. Part 4, the realization. Lieutenant General Rinya Mutaguchi was not a fool. He was a 55-year-old career officer with a record that demanded respect even from the men who despised his judgment. He had commanded the regiment at the Marco Polo Bridge in July 1937, the engagement that many historians identify as the ignition point of the Second World War in Asia. He had led the 18th Division in combat through Malaya and Burma. By 1944, he commanded the 15th Army and had designed Operation Yugo, the offensive against Impal and Kohima, with the strategic conviction of a man who had spent his career watching Japanese jungle infantry dismantle superior forces through superior doctrine. What Mutaguchi began to understand in the spring and summer of 1944, as Yugo ground to a halt against British and Indian forces that absorbed every frontal assault and then counterattacked with a coherence that Japanese doctrine had not predicted, was that something fundamental had changed inside the Allied jungle soldier. His divisional commanders were reporting a consistent anomaly. Ambush engagements that should have been decisive were being disrupted before the trigger point. Patrols that should have been fully inside the kill zone when the machine gun opened fire were arriving dispersed, or late, or not arriving at all. The takeout and ambush, the cornerstone of everything the 18th Division had built and refined for 7 years, was failing at a rate that bore no relationship to changes in Allied patrol size, terrain type, or weather. Mutaguchi wrote in his operational diary in June 1944 with a directness that the record has preserved: the enemy moves through the jungle with a confidence that suggests prior knowledge of our positions. I cannot account for this through their intelligence methods. They appear to be reading the ground itself. He was not wrong in his observation. He was wrong only in his vocabulary. He had no word for what the Allies were doing because the thing they were doing could not exist inside the categorical framework of a doctrine built around human sensory and intelligence systems. He was looking at a biological surveillance network embedded in the forest above him, and he was trying to describe it using the language of human espionage. Lieutenant General Shinichi Tanaka, whose 18th Division was absorbing the Marauders' Hukong Valley operations simultaneously with an attempted defense of Myitkyina against converging American and Chinese forces, reached the same conclusion through his characteristically precise operational lens. Tanaka was a meticulous commander. His divisional records document exact shell expenditures, route timings, and casualty figures with an administrative care that his American opponents, reading them after Myitkyina fell, found almost admirable. What those records also show, in the after-action analyses filed by his regimental commanders across the summer of 1944, is a pattern he submitted to sustained analytical attention and could not solve. A staff memorandum attached to one of Tanaka's August operational summaries reads, "Marauder patrol elements are demonstrating an early warning capability that exceeds their visible reconnaissance assets. Point men are reacting to contact at distances and with a speed that is inconsistent with visual or auditory detection under the concealment conditions our positions maintain. The source of their advanced knowledge of our positions cannot be determined from our available intelligence. It does not correspond to aerial reconnaissance patterns, informant networks, or radio intercept." General William Slim, commanding the 14th Army across the Impel-Kohima front. A man who had led the original 1942 retreat from Burma and who had spent the intervening years systematically redesigning the way British and Indian forces fought in jungle, described the change he observed in his forces during 1944 in his memoir Defeat into Victory with characteristic precision. The soldier who fights in the jungle is fighting not just the enemy, but an environment that will destroy him if he does not learn to read it. Those who learned to read it stopped being afraid of it. When a soldier stops being afraid of the jungle, he stops making the mistakes that the enemy has been waiting for him to make. The technological escalation that compounded the Japanese position arrived in the spring of 1944, and it operated on a timeline that their doctrine had been built to survive but could not accommodate. The RAF's 3rd Tactical Air Force, deploying Hawker Hurricane IIDs modified with 40 Vickers S anti-tank cannon for low-level ground attack in close support of Allied infantry in Burma, could be called to a contact location via ground-to-air radio and deliver ordnance within 7 minutes of the call. The Japanese ambush doctrine had been built in a world where air support required established communications networks, fixed forward positions, and a minimum of 40 minutes from request to delivery, time enough for an ambush element to withdraw into primary jungle and disappear. At 7 minutes, that window did not exist. An ambush that failed to trigger on schedule, that was forced to withdraw before its kill zone was activated, because the patrol had dispersed early, now found itself exposed in secondary jungle with aircraft overhead on a 7-minute call. The macaque that heard the spider hole and screamed the radio operator, who called the contact the Hurricane pilot, who was already airborne on standing patrol at 3:0 feet. These 3 elements formed a system whose components were each unremarkable, but whose combination was lethal in a way that no element of Japanese doctrine had been designed to address. For a Japanese commander reading his patrol reports in the summer of 1944, watching the takeout and success rate decline from the near certainty of 1942 to the uncertainty of 1944, there was no tactical answer. The system had been built to defeat a specific adversary who moved in a specific way. That adversary had stopped moving that way, and the system had no reserve of slack, no logistical margin, no supply cushion, no institutional permission to adapt from which a new answer could be constructed. Part 5, The Verdict. On August 3, 1944, the town of Myitkyina, Burma, terminus of the only all-weather road in northern Burma and site of the only hard-surface airfield within 500 miles, fell to Allied forces after a siege of 77 days. The 18th Division held the town's outer perimeter against 3 converging columns of marauders, 2 divisions of the Chinese Expeditionary Force under General Sun Li-jen, and continuous tactical air attack from the USAAF's 10th Air Force flying from advanced strips at Tingkok Saken. Of the approximately 3,500 Japanese defenders who had held the Myitkyina perimeter at the beginning of the siege in May, 187 survived to be taken prisoner when organized resistance ended. The remainder had died of wounds, disease, starvation, and close combat in an area of jungle and paddy field roughly 8 kilometers across. The marauders who took the town had also been destroyed as a fighting formation. Of the 2,997 men who had crossed into Burma in January 1944, fewer than 200 remained fit for duty at the final assault. Every man in the 5,307th had been declared a casualty at least once. Most had been declared a casualty more than once. This was not a clean victory in any human sense. It was two institutions consuming each other in a jungle so remote that it took war correspondents 3 weeks to reach the site. But the forensic record of the Burma campaign, read carefully and without sentimentality, tells a story that transcends its own brutality. Here is what the 18th Division was right about. Their ambush doctrine worked. In every engagement where the takeout was triggered according to its design, where an Allied point man crossed the designated terrain feature without warning and the kill zone was activated on schedule, the outcome was immediate, decisive, and massively favorable to the ambushers. The doctrine was not flawed. It had worked in Malaya, it had worked in Singapore, it had worked in the 1942 advance across Burma. In the conditions for which it had been designed, fighting an adversary measuring success in the same currency, it remained one of the most effective infantry tactics ever codified. Here is the metric the 18th Division was using that made the Allied approach look, to a rational Japanese staff officer, like institutional incompetence bordering on madness. A Japanese intelligence officer examining a Marauder supply manifest, macaques between plasma and ammunition handler rations. Veterinary supply requests would have concluded using every analytical tool his training, provided that he was looking at a supply system so vast and so undisciplined that it was indulging in behavior no army fighting for its survival could afford. Animals, on a combat requisition, listed as equipment. In a war, he would have been measuring the Allies by the only metric his institution had ever taught him to use. Every resource that does not kill the enemy is a resource consumed without return. A macaque that costs $12 and a handler's training time is $12 and one trained handler not deployed against the mission. In a division receiving 40% of its minimum supply requirement, that calculation is not optional. It is survival arithmetic, and it is correct within its own framework. Here is what the Allies were actually optimizing for: not per engagement casualty exchange, not ammunition efficiency, not the geometry of any individual ambush. They were optimizing for patrol return rate, the percentage of patrols that completed their assigned mission, returned with actionable intelligence, and kept their personnel available for the next 72 hours of operations. Every carried macaque that prevented one patrol from entering one kill zone was worth not $12, but the full downstream value of that patrol's intelligence product, the continued operational capacity of its 12 members, and the decisions those 12 men would make in the following week. In a system built on abundance, on 650,000 tons airlift capacity, on aircraft factories producing 85,000 planes per year, on a logistics chain that could replace a lost macaque by air inside 48 hours, the calculation ran in the opposite direction entirely. Every resource that preserves the life of a trained man who can continue operating is a resource that compounds. The two metrics were not just different in magnitude, they were invisible to each other across the divide of doctrine. The Japanese staff officer measuring shell efficiency could look at an Allied supply manifest and see waste. The Allied G4 officer measuring patrol return rate could look at the same manifest and see investment. Both men were reading the same piece of paper. Both men were right within their own framework. The one whose framework stopped mattering was the one whose supply line could not sustain adaptation. The philosophical core of what happened in that Burmese jungle is this. The Imperial Japanese Army constructed a system of extraordinary sophistication, patient, geometrically precise, built on years of hard operational experience, and then surrounded that system with logistical constraints so absolute that the system could only be maintained by stripping away every capacity for adaptation. They optimized so completely for scarcity that they lost the institutional ability to imagine abundance. And when abundance arrived, in the form of a 650-ton airlift over the Himalayas, in the form of a hurricane pilot on a 7-minute call, in the form of a 4-pound macaque in a canvas sling who could hear a spider hole opening in the dark 60 meters ahead of a patrol, they had no doctrine for it. Because their doctrine had been built by men whose arithmetic could not afford to believe such things were achievable. It compounded in the form of a macaque that heard a Japanese squad settling into ambush position at 300 hours and screamed before the first man in the takeout could confirm the patrol was inside the kill zone, buying PFC Hollies and his 11 companions 31 seconds and their lives. It compounded in the form of a C-47 Dakota, banking over a dirt strip at Shajazup in March 1944, dropping 2 replacement macaques in wooden crates alongside 4 cases of 30 caliber ball and 12 units of plasma, a supply manifest so routine that the dispatcher in Assam who loaded it would not have given it a second thought. It compounded in the form of a Miat airfield built by Japanese labor in 1942. Operational under Allied control by June 1944, receiving 71 tons of cargo per month by the following year. The same airfield that the 18th Division had been ordered to hold at any cost had held for 77 days. And had finally surrendered not because their courage failed, but because their arithmetic did. The men of the 5,307th Composite Unit Provisional suffered a casualty rate of 93% over 8 months of continuous operation. They were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. Their records are held in College Park, Maryland, in boxes that few researchers open anymore. PFC Raymond Hollies of Macon, Georgia, walked out of the Burmese jungle in September 1944. He returned to Macon in March 1945. His service record notes a single personal effect entered at the theater quartermaster upon departure from the CBI command, 1 canvas equipment sling, worn, returned unserviceable. He never talked about Burma. Some debts are paid in silences that outlast the men who carried them.